much, Jose, and thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be able to talk to you about migration asylum policy on the EU level. I would very much like to endorse what you just said as an introductory statement. I think it's very important to look at the reality on the ground, but also look at the policies that exist and that can be changed. And I think that's very important. So what I am trying to do in my initial input here is to give you an overview, a kind of tour de force of the current EU migration asylum policies that there are, but also look at potentials for change, look at potentials of further development as we go along. I will try to share my slides. I hope this works. Can you all see that now? Hope it's working.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, that is great. That is great. So let me just start with some recent developments at the EU migration policy level. And really it starts in 2020 when we not only had, as you all probably very well know, the big fire at the refugee camp Moria at Lesbos, which it's still not quite clear how and why the fire was started. But what was clear is that Moria was a camp originally designed as part of the EU hotspot system for around 3,000 people. And at a point in time when the fire broke out during the first year of the pandemic, it hosted about 12,000 people, most of whom had to live in tents with little to no protection from the weather, the environment, and so on. So that was around at the same time when the EU Commission presented its new pact on migration, the so-called EU Migration Pact, with really a wealth of proposals of how to, in their view, ameliorate the situation, of how to bring about, as Commission President von der Leyen said, a fresh start. And interestingly enough, many references to Moria were made in this initial press conference when the pact and its key parameters were presented. So the EU Commissioner for the Interior, Ylva Johansson, decidedly said this pact is designed exactly in order to prevent more of Morias to happen. So what will happen in Moria, this overburdening of the system, the fact that basic human needs could no longer be met for the many thousands of refugees hosted there, and finally the fire that broke out, we want to prevent this in the future. So really the motto was no more Morias, and we'll later discuss whether that is indeed the fact or is true when we look at the proposals in the pact. Now, fast forward a few years, because what happened between 2020 and 2023 was there were a lot of negotiations on the pact. There was a lot of sort of strategic positioning by the member states. We had, in particular, as regards to Visegrad states, Poland, Hungary, and others, which decidedly said we do not endorse this pact at all, and we do not share any of the proposals enshrined in there. But of course, on the other hand, there was also much opposition happening from humanitarian organizations and NGOs working on the ground, who said that this EU migration pact means overall more restrictive asylum rules for the EU. Fast forward to June 2023, when we had a first decisive step towards a decision, when the EU ministers of the Interior met in Luxembourg, and they did reach an agreement on the key pillars of the pact. They reached this agreement with qualified majority, so not all the member states agreed on it, but most of them did. And this was a decisive moment because this meant that the EU could move things forward as concerns the key ideas in the pact. And I will just later on talk about what the main pillars are. In summer, then also what happened at the same time, because the arrivals across the Mediterranean increased and also deaths in the Mediterranean increased massively. The situation in Lampedusa became more and more of a spotlight again. So what happened was that the EU tried to strike a deal with Tunisia. Another example of the ongoing externalization trend on the EU level. So we had Commission President von der Leyen and the Prime Ministers of Italy and the Netherlands who went to Tunis, the capital of Tunisia, and agreed on strengthening a strategic partnership with the country. So the idea was that the EU should pay overall $1 billion for a variety of measures, also economic measures, but mainly in order to prevent so-called irregular or illegal, as they even called it, migration, with a view to reducing arrivals via boat across the Mediterranean. This happened at the same time while we had ongoing negotiations about the other key aspects of the pact. As you all know, probably, what happened over the summer last year was actually the exact opposite. Also, we had this quite prestigious meeting of high-level officials and high-level politicians, and both sides agreed on this partnership. Arrivals across the Mediterranean did not decrease, but actually increased over the summer, which is a kind of paradoxical effect of migration policy that has been shown again and again in studies, namely that when you proclaim something that you want to do something, so if you announce that a policy is soon going to be put into place, this means that, of course, you're giving migrants, but you're also giving smugglers some leeway and some time to react to that. And they actually use this kind of announcement to promote the sort of passing of the Mediterranean right now, sooner than later. So we saw a kind of now or never upturn in crossings of the Mediterranean. And also we saw much more deaths this summer than happened the years before that. So there was a kind of paradoxical, contradictory effect of this intended agreement with Tunisia. I say intended because what also became clear in late summer was that Tunisia all of a sudden seemed less interested in striking the deal. They voiced some concerns that this was not a partnership on an equal footing. And in particular, they said they don't want to do border policing for the EU, because this is what it all boils down to when we look at sort of the main intention for this partnership from the EU side. Then over the fall of last year, again, negotiations continued, and then a final breakthrough, in inverted commas, was reached in December last year in Brussels in some overnight negotiations that took more than 24 hours. But after that, in a trialogue, so the EU Commission, the Council, and the Parliament did agree on the key components of the asylum reform. So the common European asylum system was to be reformed in the key ways in which it was proposed in the EU Migration Pact. And most notably, and this was something that was mediatized heavily, this agreement could only be reached because you know that it has to be a unanimous decision. So all the member states had to agree, and Hungary notoriously said it will not agree on burden sharing, on sharing within the asylum responsibility of the EU. So what they did was they waited for Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, to leave the room, and then would take the vote so it could be passed. And what we're now looking ahead to is a vote in the plenary session of the European Parliament. This is supposed to happen in April this year, when there will be, I think, several critical and oppositional voices be heard, because we know that several fractions in the European Parliament are still very critical of the reform, but overall it is to be expected to be passed. So what we will see right before the elections to the European Parliament in June is that the key pillars of this reform will be passed. Then, of course, it's up to the next legislative period to put these into practice. So what actually was agreed on? What are some of the key components of this reform? First of all, I want to start by saying that this is a highly complex legal matter, and I feel like not even some of the people working on all the details of this are familiar with how, or know at this point, how it should be implemented. So a big point of criticism is not only that overall asylum regulations in the EU will become more restrictive, it will become more difficult for some groups of people to seek asylum in Europe, but also it will be very tricky to implement all these complex regulations into the individual national legal systems and on the ground. So this is also a very big point of criticism from the side of experts. First of all, the member states and the EU Commission and Parliament agreed on border procedures. Border procedures, I think, do not even deserve the term procedure, because they are not procedures, decidedly, but they are sort of rapid screenings that have to happen within 12 weeks, so 3 months, for those people who come from countries with a historically low acceptance rate, and this rate was set at 20%, lower than 20%. So let me just take one example. For instance, if a Pakistani national arrives on EU territory, he or she would qualify for this border procedure, because in most EU member states, Pakistani citizens historically had an acceptance rate lower than 20%. And this means that this person will not immediately get access to a fair actual asylum procedure, but rather, first of all, be submitted to this border procedure, where it's decided whether he or she will indeed be able to receive an actual asylum procedure and be heard in front of a court and get fair treatment, be heard all of his grounds and so on. So what will happen then in the border procedure is a kind of rapid decision that will be made. And in many cases, as we know also from pilot projects that have already been carried out, mostly in the EU member states with external borders, we know that in border procedures, you have very high rejection rates. So most individuals who are streamlined into this border procedure track will be rejected and will have to leave EU territory again without being able to officially make their asylum claim heard. The only exception that the EU member states agreed on are unaccompanied minors. They will immediately, all of them, regardless of nationality, get access to an actual asylum procedure. Germany very much argued for an exception for all families arriving, but most other member states disagreed. So it's only unaccompanied minors. And what actually some experts say, and I would confer with that, is that this carries a higher risk of actually the smuggling industry responding to this and, focusing even more on unaccompanied minors, promoting this as kind of the only way for a whole family to get access to the EU, so that we will see an increase in unaccompanied minors making the journey. So this is again something that should be prevented by the EU rather than even promoted by sort of contradictory policies here. Another key pillar in this reform is asylum centers that are to be established in member states with external borders, mainly Italy, Greece, Spain. Now, if that sounds familiar, yes, it is familiar. And for many experts, and I would include myself, it's not quite clear how that would actually mean a massive change from the current system. This is basically the hotspot system that we've seen in recent years all over again. And it's not clear how this would share or spread the burden, so to say, equally, or take away some of the pressure from the member states with external borders. Because in practice, what we can expect very soon to happen is that people who underwent the border procedure but were rejected, many of them will not return voluntarily to their home countries. And in many cases, the home countries might not even be interested in taking them back. So there will be sort of a backlog happening soon. The same happened in Moria, for instance. So even if these asylum centers are initially well-structured, good sanitation systems, good sort of overall facility management and so on, it can mean in practice that very soon, over a very short period of time, there will be more and more people filling up these centers. And again, there's a high risk of sort of creating informal lodgings, tents around these official centers, because people can't be deported on the one hand, but also people in many cases will be rejected and are not allowed to officially enter EU territory. So this idea of restricting mobility is one of the key points of criticisms from humanitarian organizations, that during this period of 12 weeks, EU member states are allowed to restrict the mobility of arriving migrants. So yes, they can voluntarily return and go back, but they are not allowed to move further into EU territory. And this, some say, is like being forced into sort of a kind of imprisonment-like situation. And of course, asylum centers are not supposed to be prisons. So this idea of fictional non-entry is what the legal term is here. Another key aspect, and this was the main reason why Viktor Orban had to leave the room, is because the member states agreed on mandatory solidarity with flexibility. If that sounds like kind of oxymoron and a contradiction in of itself, I think it really is, because the idea behind this mandatory solidarity is that the member states all have to share in some way in this asylum burden. Every member state has to do its part, but they get to choose in which way they want to participate. So it's mandatory, but it's also flexible in a way. So member states can either opt to host refugees themselves, also relocate refugees from other member states. They can also decide to contribute financially to other member states. And there was even a price that the member states found that should be allocated per refugee, which is 20,000 euros. Or member states can also opt to engage in alternative measures. So for instance, to support deployment of personnel, to support deportations, to provide support for capacity building in other member states and so on. So there is a whole wealth really of options that you can choose from. Still, as I said, some member states like Hungary said that none of these options will do. We will not participate in any shape, way or form in supporting the EU asylum system because we simply do not want to accept any kind of asylum seekers. And finally, what was also agreed on, and this I find somewhat funny, funny might be the wrong word, but somewhat absurd in this context, that the EU member states agreed to enforce deportations of rejected asylum seekers, but they agreed that amongst themselves, but did not include the countries of origin. And of course, they play a key role when it comes to returning people whose asylum claim was rejected. So even if the EU member states agree on this, the key partners they should talk with and include in this decision are, of course, the home countries and the transit countries, and they were not even part of these negotiations. So I think this is really just an expression of a political will, but how this will be put into practice is really another question. Another key aspect of this new reform is the so-called crisis regulation. This also brought about huge discussions and many negotiations among the member states. The idea is that member states can impose exceptional measures when a crisis situation appears, and the crisis situation is basically when a particularly high number of migrants arrive in a given member state. Initially, the idea was that each and every member state can decide on its own whether this is now a crisis or not, which I think would have really meant a complete overhaul of the system, because we know that crisis talk has also become a strategic weapon in the political arena. Now I think there was some kind of a better situation reached that only a qualified majority of all member states can actually decide that a crisis is in fact occurring. For instance, also this can be applied to the so-called instrumentalization of migrants, or as some political actors call it, I do not like the term, but just for reference, a hybrid warfare by sending migrants, by sending vulnerable people to the EU border. And this is something we've seen over the last couple of years, really starting in late 2021 at the Polish-Belarusian border, where we now know for a fact that already by that point, it was really Vladimir Putin behind that, aiming to destabilize Europe by sending migrants there. But also, it's not only about high arrivals at land borders, but also sea borders. So it can also be applied to search and rescue missions in the Mediterranean, for instance, by NGOs. So if there is a high number of rescued migrants and a high number of NGO boats that arrive on the shore, then this can also be classified as a crisis situation, and given member states can say, we actually further restrict mobility of migrants in the border procedures, and we actually subject all migrants, and this is the key aspect in this crisis regulation, we subject all arriving migrants to the border procedures. So there are really no exceptions here. Again, the only exception is unaccompanied minors. But in this crisis regulation, it would mean that the nationality of the arriving migrant is completely irrelevant, and everyone who arrives is subjected to quick border procedures. And overall, this would just really mean undermining existing asylum regulations as we've known it for decades. Meanwhile, what happened meanwhile? I think it's important not only to look at what the EU decided and wants to do, but also what happened on the ground, and really literally on the ground, I'm afraid. Because at the same time, when the EU was discussing becoming more restrictive towards arriving migrants, we saw one of the hugest shipwrecks of the last decades, really. In June 2023, we had this shipwreck with about 500 to 700 passengers that drowned off the coast of Pylos. It's yet unclear what the role of the Greek Coast Guard was and in how far they were immediately involved, maybe even immediately responsible for this shipwreck to happen. What we've also seen over the last couple of years is illegal pushbacks becoming an integral part of the asylum system. So when people say border control, what they mean, its end really is pushbacks, because it's the only way how you can control borders if migrants try to cross it, but are supposed to be kept from crossing borders by border guards. And this means the border guards have to engage in illegal pushbacks. In many cases, not always, but in most cases, this also means violence, so becoming physically violent. And we know for a fact now, and there has been more and more evidence surfacing, empirical evidence by journalists, by researchers, and so on, that pushbacks happen, I want to say, on a daily basis across the Balkan route. They happen also, and there's just recent evidence between Germany and Austria. They happen in the Mediterranean. In last summer, a video surfaced by an Austrian refugee helper that documented how the Greek Coast Guard picks up people who already arrived on the Greek mainland, and those were mostly women and children, and transfers them back onto little dingies in the Mediterranean. Yeah? So this is sort of the textbook definition, I want to say, of pushbacks. And we also know for a fact that this very Greek Coast Guard is partially funded by EU money. What we also have is now that in some member states, the asylum system has virtually been abolished, but this has so far led to no consequences for these member states. The prime example, again, being Hungary. There are now several rulings by the European Court of Justice stating clearly that Hungary violates EU law because its asylum rules are too strict. In fact, Hungary only accepted, I think, about 10 or so asylum applications over the last year, which is utterly absurd considering that its immediate neighbor, Austria, accepted in the same year more than 100,000 asylum applications. But even though we have these rulings by the European Court of Justice, nothing has happened. Hungary still receives funding by the EU. No sanctions have been put into place. And I think what this also means is negative consequences for the remaining member states which fulfill their asylum duty. So there are still member states who try to uphold rule of law also in the asylum system. But of course, the system becomes increasingly unfair if more and more member states opt out of it, so to say. And what we see now, and have been seeing over the last couple of years, is a race to the bottom. More and more member states joining this race to the bottom, which means that the system becomes even more unfair for the remaining member states. And then finally, and this is, I would say, one of the big trends, and trends in inverted commas really, externalization. The London High Court ruled that externalization to Rwanda is illegal. It's not a safe country because there are huge deficiencies in the asylum system there. Nonetheless, not only the UK government is trying to find ways of making this legal and of actually getting legal approval also by the High Court, even the German government is now very, very seriously exploring options of externalizing to Rwanda. And I think we all know what this means. if Germany will start externalizing. So I think this is something to really keenly watch in the future, this trend towards externalization. And of course, also, though to a somewhat lesser degree, we could also look at the recent Italy-Albania agreement that has been reached, which is also an example of externalizing asylum responsibility. And we will see how this actually will affect asylum rules and protection for vulnerable people. Further trends also, so externalization I mentioned, I would say also on the level of rhetoric, a really new and very hard discourse happening by politicians, also by politicians who are not part of sort of the right-wing spectrum, but really would define themselves as center or even left to the center. Very strong and harsh rhetoric, and we all know that rhetoric again influences the policies made and influences votes very much. So this is something to be watched. The race to the bottom I mentioned. Something that I think we should also watch very keenly is trends towards datafication, artificial intelligence, and digital border management. Very much already being used at the US-Mexican border, where, for instance, migrants arriving from Mexico have to lodge their asylum claim via an app on their phone, which comes with huge racial biases, as we all know, all of these apps do. So, for instance, people have to scan their faces, but the app, because of the inbuilt racial bias, is not really good at detecting brown and black faces. So this means that many people are at a disadvantage for actually getting a spot in the asylum system. And of course, within these informal lodgings on the US-Mexican border, many of them don't have stable Wi-Fi connection, etc., etc. So this comes with huge, huge problems, really. But I think this is an overall trend that we will very soon also see in the EU. And then another trend that seems anachronistic, because I just talked about new technologies and AI, and now I'm talking about walls and fences, which sounds like we're back in the Middle Ages. But indeed, we now have many more walls and fortification worldwide than we did during the Cold War. So border walls have been on the increase, although research is very clear here that walls do not keep people from migrating. It only means that people have to opt for even more dangerous routes and have to find a way to circumvent borders. But nonetheless, more and more countries opt for these. And just yesterday, I think, the EU Parliament barely rejected a proposition to use EU funds to support member states in building walls or fences. This was rejected, but only by a very small majority in the EU Parliament. So what can we do now? What can scholars and policy analysts contribute to the debate, and how can we change this or turn this around? So something that sounds very banal in times like these, but I still believe in this. And I think it's still very important to present empirical facts. So I just mentioned, for instance, that most of studies that I'm familiar with very clearly show that walls and fences do not keep people from migrating. And this is a very sort of banal fact, but it's still important to present this to the public and to policymakers, to politicians, and to state clearly what the empirical evidence is, especially in times like these, where we see an increased discrepancy between the rhetoric on the one hand and the reality on the other hand. So there is this huge discrepancy, and this has to be addressed, I think, by scholars and by policy analysts. I also think it's very important to expose narratives, to expose constructed imagery. I'm thinking of Lampedusa as a chronic crisis. I'm thinking of pictures of overburdened systems, overburdened asylum centers, asylum seekers only being young single men, where we know that we have increasing numbers of women and children, but they are not presented in media. This whole notion of if climate change increases, then there will be an African storm towards Europe. And this is sometimes even used by climate activists as an argument, which I find very, very dangerous, because it pits really one humanitarian crisis against the other. So I think really to expose frames and narratives is key. It's important to contextualize and contrast, to look at numbers. One fact that I repeat again and again, because I think it's so important, the large majority of migration to Europe is regular migration, labor migration, people responding to increased labor needs, and only a very small percentage is so-called irregular migration, forced migration. But the way we look at it is we scandalize this small percentage and blow it up in huge proportions. And then, of course, the public gets the impression that this is a problem that has run out of hands, that cannot be managed. And I think this is also an issue. Also, something we can do is, I think, to point to open weaknesses, to questions and loose ends. And I think there are several of these loose ends in the reform as it stands now. So many things, many details seem unclear. It's unclear how they are to be implemented or how actually this will sustainably change and optimize the system, not only for arriving migrants, but also for the member states and host countries. It's not clear how that will, over time, really ameliorate the situation. And then, of course, I think it's important to overall contribute to these debates, but also by contributing to suggest alternatives. So not only stop by criticizing what is proposed now, but really I see it as important in this day and age for scholars and within a critical policy discourse to also present innovations and new perspective, to also try to show how different systems can be possible and how they can move from being just a vision to being put into action. And there, I think we can very well start at the local level, because a lot of things are working on the local level, as we know, city to city arrivals and so on, but also these can be moved up to a higher level and also maybe become models for international cooperation too. So with this, I would like to sort of lead into discussion by some questions or things to consider. I think that overall, especially when we look at the role of scholarship, the role of policy analysis, there's a high risk of political instrumentalization from all sides, really. And also there is such a high demand for definite answers that sometimes we run the risk of undermining the complexity. And it's really important to me to say that this is a complex issue, and there are also some hard truths that come with it. One hard truth, for instance, there will also be a certain percentage of irregular migration. You know, we cannot completely regularize the system, even if we do create more legal pathways, more safe pathways, but there will always be a certain percentage. So what will this mean for the concept of the nation state and so on? There are certain dilemmas within the policy field. There are certain conflict of goals, and I think we have to be transparent of those. Then, of course, it's a question of time and resources for scholarship overall, I would say, but also the question of what is impact and how much impact is possible. So what actually counts as impact? Is a contribution to the debate already enough of an impact, or should we just aim really for actual policy change? And how frustrating does this become if we do not see this policy change right away? And then, of course, the stakeholders are important to consider, I think, EU stakeholders, but also very much on the regional and local level. I think this is often overlooked, but here, in my experience, you can find a high level of cooperation, because people realize on the local levels, it's not so important what the overall ideology is, the discourse is, it's important that things work. And so because everyone is interested in things working out, people tend to be more cooperative in my experience. So it's really worthwhile to also look at regional, local level. And then, of course, a big question, and maybe this is something also that towards the end we can also discuss, how do you navigate between the demands of being sort of a distant scholar, but also being publicly engaged, which I think we all are in this group here. This is important to consider, or to actually be just aware of a different of a risk of instrumentalization, as I said, but also be aware of what can be achieved by scholarship, what can be achieved by actively entering a public debate. And we have similar discussions going on when it comes to the climate crisis, scholars researching the climate crisis, but also taking a very decided stance, saying that not only do we want to present our scientific results, we also want to see these results put into practice. And I think here we see clearly, this is something that Andrew Hoffman coined in his book, this notion of being an engaged scholar, which I very much feel is also present in this arena here. So with this, I thank you very much for your attention. I'm very much looking forward to any questions or comments you might have, and of course to an inspiring discussion. So thank you very much again for having me.